Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome here for a dialogue which nearly has become a tradition here in Davos, the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton. I remember, Mr. President, when we met 10 weeks ago in Chappaqua, you expressed, and it was before the election, we didn't know yet who will be president, and you expressed two wishes in view of the new administration. The first one was that actually whoever will be president, he will have to reach out to the world, and the world has to assist him, because the challenges can only be solved through cooperation. And the second message which you had was we should not only look at the economic crisis, but we should not forget all those other issues which are so close to your heart now, since and even during the time you were, since you left presidency and now, and even the time you were president. Now, I would like to ask you, we were talking so much here about the crisis, and I think we are all wondering to hear your analysis. What led us to the present situation we are in, Mr. President?
Well, the Chinese premier is right. It all started in the United States. And I think it happened for a number of reasons. I think the approximate cause obviously was the failure in the subprime mortgage market and the securities that were issued out of it and the derivatives that were issued out of them. But there was, in general, too much leverage, and a lot of our financing and the risk analysis was too loose, and the regulation was too poor. But in addition to that, I think it's important to recognize that in 2001, when the high-tech bubble burst in America, we had lots of money sloshing around in our country, and the Federal Reserve tried to keep interest rates low to minimize the length of the recession, which they did. But America had no real economic strategy for creating new jobs, new businesses, and new sectors. So all the job growth in our country was in housing, finance, and consumer spending. So not surprisingly, we put too much money into housing, and then people found interesting financial mechanisms out of that, and the American people maxed out their credit cards, and we went down the road which led to all the other things. I think the most important thing, though, is there will be, I think, a great reluctance, not only in our country but throughout the world, to get into that kind of carelessness and risk assessment and high leverage kind of artificial growth situation again. And I believe that when we get through this, we'll have a 21st century finance system that will make money the old-fashioned way by investing in goods and services that are needed for the modern world. So I think it'll be quite a modern economy, but I think we'll go back to a lot more traditional finance. People will still make money, but it won't be like it was in this decade, and I think that'll be a good thing. But the main thing is to get through this as quickly as we can. I think President Obama has an excellent economic team, and I think they'll make good decisions. And these problems are, at one level, mind-numbingly complex, and at another, it's fairly simple. We have now a global crisis of asset deflation, and we've got to put a floor under those assets, and America has to lead the way because it started there. But I think he's got a really good team, and they're coming to grips with the enormity and complexity of the challenges, and I think I believe that we'll get through this. People always ask, when will it be over? And I want to say at 3:15, November the 7th, 2009. Nobody knows. But I think somewhere a year, 15 months, if we're lucky and he gets good support from the Congress, we could be on the way up the whole world by then.
But just reading the news this morning, you said getting good support, and what we have seen, everybody hoped of a bipartisan support, and that's not what we are seeing now. How do you interpret this situation?
Well, I think, first of all, let's wait and see how they vote on the final passage of the bill. I think some Republicans will support it. In the way American politics works, that they all opposed my economic plan in 1993, too. They said it would lead to disaster. We'd never have any economic growth. I was bringing on a recession. They think the minority party generally tends to think its first 2 or 3 no votes are free. That is, that if things go badly, they can say, I told you so, and if they don't, people will forget it. But I saw that the president last night once again reached out to them, had them at the White House. He's still working them. I think that, I think that some of them will have to come along. And if they don't, I think they'll pay a big price if it looks like they're just standing in the way. But keep in mind, this is just the opening bell here. The Republicans always want more tax cuts and less spending, even though all the economics analysis shows that you get more growth and more jobs out of investment. There's a bigger multiplier effect. The problem that the president and his economic advisors have is that the investments that are best for America over the long run, for our long-term productivity, don't necessarily have the quickest payout. So it's obvious that he should finance, let's say, the highway projects that have already been drawn up and that are ready to go, and the bridge repairs and the rail repairs. But we have a staggering something like 200,000 megawatts of wind energy projects waiting to be brought to fruition that can't be put up until we have more of a national electric grid, because the wind blows hardest in America where the fewest people are. So the capacity, the electrical carrying capacity in these rural areas is not so great. Well, it takes time to plan and build that. So those are the kinds of choices they're having to make in that area. We'll work through it. But keep in mind, they just got there. They're doing pretty well, I think.
But Bill, were you not surprised yesterday when you listened to Prime Minister Putin and he told the audience here, please be warned, don't have a state-owned economy because it kills entrepreneurial spirit and it kills competition. What change we have in the world? How do you feel about it? And you soon will have to defend a state-owned bad bank here.
Well, I actually favor that. Keep in mind that this is the first. I'm glad to hear Prime Minister Putin come out for free enterprise. And I hope it works for him. But let's be serious here. That one of the decisions that's being debated in Washington is, should there be, because so many of the banks are in trouble now. This started with deflation in housing prices and securities on mortgages, right? Now you've got deflation in the value of assets generally, causing a lot of our banks to be in trouble. So some people are saying, well, we ought to nationalize the banks. Others are saying we ought to have a bad bank. I don't like that term, bad bank, because the only really toxic assets here are the bundled securities of subprime mortgages and anything that was spun out of that. these other loans that are in trouble are just because the asset values are below what their traditional value would be. So it shouldn't be called a bad bank. In the Depression, the United States had a system to buy houses that were in trouble and home mortgages, and then they were resold onto the market as the economy began to pick up, and the taxpayers recovered all their money. So if we have to sell Treasury notes to foreigners now, which we have to do because we doubled the debt of America in the last 8 years with a policy that those of you who are Americans know I strongly opposed, other countries have to finance this recovery, but it's good for them because we can't buy exports until we grow again. I think we should have a bank to hold these undervalued assets, clean up the bank's balance sheets, get them to loan again, and then in a disciplined fashion put the assets back on the market, recover it, and use the receipts to pay back the Treasury notes. I think that's the most orderly way and the quickest way to clean up these banks. And I think it's very important because keep in mind, bank lending will be more important to the recovery of America and therefore to the recovery of the world than all the stimulus spending. The president has proposed this massive program, but it's about 6% of GDP. We have a $13.5 trillion economy. Today, the American banks have $600 billion on deposit with the Federal Reserve, which means those things are available as reserves for loans, but not yet pledged to them. So they have a theoretical lending capacity of $6 trillion, much bigger than $880 billion. But they can't make those loans now because of the asset valuation problem. So I think that's what should be done. And I don't think it's the state taking over the economy. I think that the government, look, central banks came into existence because of market failures and the need to manage debt and float debt. You just look at the whole 300-year history of them. I mean, this is, I wouldn't say normal, but it is not without precedent. And it's pretty clear what has to be done, and I think they'll do it, and I think they'll do a good job of it.
So actually, we should not call it a bad bank. We should call it ICU bank, intensive care unit bank, in some way.
That's better.
Or rescue bank.
Yeah, because when you come out of ICU, if you get good care, then you're healthy again. That's what I think is going to happen here.
Now, Mr. President, we had Premier Wen Jiabao here, and there was a discussion directly or indirectly about the dispute concerning the Chinese currency. Now, I don't want to ask you to take position concerning that point, but what we need in order to come out of this crisis is a high degree of global cooperation. And we see now the President Obama is taking bold measures in the United States to get the U.S. back on the rails. When you look around the world, and particularly also protectionist tendencies, do you feel the world has the will to cooperate in terms of managing this crisis? Or isn't it a beggar my neighbor policy, which we will see?
Well, let me back up and say I think that people are frightened now. There's a lot of fear out there in the economy. So I don't think that now is the best time in the world to get new trade agreements. But I also believe that intelligent people all over the world will see that this is not necessarily the time to pick new fights either. We have to get out of this together. I will say it more plainly than I did before. The United States, when I left office, we had paid down about $600 billion on the national debt, and we had about a $240 or $50 billion annual surplus. The fiscal and spending policies of the last administration doubled the debt of the country. So we can't finance the president's plans unless other people buy our Treasury notes. We don't, it's not like the Japanese could finance a lot of their own stimulus in the 90s when they were in trouble. And when we had the Depression in the 1930s and President Roosevelt financed the expansionary programs. A lot of Americans had heavy savings buried in the mattress or locked in the closet, and they could buy government bonds. We can't possibly get the American economy out of this without support from China, from basically countries that are export dependent, cash rich, but also hurt. They should support us if they believe that President Obama's plans are good, will work, and will bring us back to a point where we can purchase their exports again. And not only that, start a ricochet effect so that other countries will be coming up and they will be able to purchase, we'll be able to trade. Then when there's a higher level of collective security, we can look at what we should do to expand it. But keep in mind, this financial crisis proves, as nothing else should or could, the fundamental fact that global interdependence is more important than anything else in the world today. We cannot escape each other. Divorce is not an option. You know, the Chinese premier was right. All this started in the United States, but it is having an explosive effect in his country because they're closing down factories, and you've got all these Chinese people who have been working in an environment where they had almost double-digit growth every year. What are they supposed to do? If they stay in the city, how are they going to live? How are they going to be supported? If they go back to the rural area, there are no jobs there. So there's all this dislocation. He's got a lot of problems in China. We have to pull out of this together. We have to build a world of shared benefits and shared responsibilities. And the financial crisis is only the latest example of that, which is why, to go back to your other point, I say we shouldn't forget about our other mutual responsibilities, because the world is, look, a lot of the modern world's been good, or you couldn't afford to be here in spite of everything. Right? I mean, even if you've lost a lot of money, look at all of us. We showed up. I mean, and they were rerouting planes as far away as Milan to the airport. So we've all done pretty well in this interdependent world. And we just have to realize that instability, inequality, and the unsustainability of it because of global warming are facts of life. And we'd better deal with them together.
Bill, I come back to those other issues in a moment, and I have one maybe last question related to the economy. If you look at the origins of the crisis, some people would argue it was, and you just elaborated on it, it was the overconsumption of the United States, financed by savings mainly from Asia, which allowed Asia to export to the United States. Now, if we relaunch the economy in stimulating the U.S. consumer, don't we prolong the problem? Because we keep the imbalance, and we may even extend the imbalance.
Well, my answer to that is yes and no. Right now, the world is in so much trouble. We've got so many, $30 trillion in wealth have disappeared in the last 4.5, 5 months. That is more than twice the annual GDP of America and about half the annual GDP of the entire world. And my view is when you've got that many people in trouble and continuing risks of problems spinning out of control, you should take the shortest path to recovery. I already said, let me say again, I don't believe that the kinds of financial problems which led to America's financial collapse will be repeated. President Obama has said he recognizes that on the other side of this, America will have to have more savings, more spending restraint, and more of its own generated growth through production of goods and services, and everybody else will. You see this all over the world. That we talked about it on the way out here, but that in a small example of that in terms of global GDP is the acknowledgement of the president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, that we made a mistake to stop supporting agricultural development in developing countries in 1981, and we should go back to doing it. I think there will be a general reassessment of how we can maximize trade and domestic production and what kinds of cooperative fiscal policies we need when this is over. Right now, the house is on fire, and we need to put it out as quickly as we can. And the quickest way to do it is to stop the deflation in asset prices and do it in a way that allows the financial system that did bring us a lot of growth over the last 20 years to kick back in.
Now, we all know how much you are engaged in addressing some of the other issues, and you have talked to this audience on several occasions about it. If I take now the beginning of 2009, what is your biggest worry in terms, is it malaria, is it what? I know we cannot classify those worries, but what you personally feel most emotional about it at this particular moment?
Well, I'd like to make 3 quick points because it's based on my experience. First, I'm really, really worried that because so much wealth has been lost, that the impulse of the wealthy to help the poorest among us on earth, out of a concern that we have to share the future, will be totally blunted. It's okay if you can't spend as much money as you were spending. Everybody understands that. But we haven't repealed the laws of interdependence. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Let's just take health care. Our foundation is responsible for the drug contracts that provide AIDS medicine to about 1.5 million people. And about 2/3 of all the children in the developing world who get AIDS medicine. The price and availability of AIDS drugs is no longer the determinant of whether you live or die. That's the good news. Thanks to the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria, thanks to PEPFAR, thanks to the Gates Foundation, a lot of us have been working in this, thanks to all the bilateral donors. The same thing is now happening with malaria. We've got discount prices on malaria, and we're trying to get that out. The big barrier that is killing people in poor countries around the world today is the absence of health systems, particularly in rural areas in developing nations. And what I have found is that I can go out and raise all the money in the world for medicine, but I have to raise most of the money to build out health systems from private donors who are really strapped now. So there needs to be a reassessment of our obligations to help developing countries build at least rudimentary health systems which will have dramatic results, not just in AIDS and malaria and TB, but also in maternal and child health and infectious diseases right across the world. Second example, we talked about agricultural development in low-income countries. We now know how to really spark growth in developing countries. 10 years ago, when I first went to Rwanda, 4 years after the genocide, the per capita income was about $260 a year. Last year, it exceeded 1,000. They quadrupled the income of the country in a decade. That's pretty good. And I think President Kagame is here somewhere. I mean, it's a lot of it. He deserves a lot of credit for that. But the world also wanted to help. The point is, they were organized. They did it right. We shouldn't give up on that. And the place to begin, I think, in a lot of these countries is helping them to feed themselves and to generate all the spinoff jobs you can if you have the right sort of agricultural projects. And the third thing I'd like to say is there was a study this week released by an international panel saying that it will take 1,000 years for the temperature of the earth to cool, even if we reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050. And I worry that we still have too many people who believe that the only way to reduce greenhouse gases is to slow economic growth. We will never get an agreement in Copenhagen unless we have a sense that from the poorest countries to the wealthiest, there are economically beneficial ways to dramatically change the energy patterns of the world. I believe that based on the work I do and the things I've seen. And I believe I could demonstrate it to anybody. I believe that the Obama administration, if we can get the banks lending again, I think we could. I'll make you a prediction. If we can get bank lending going again, of all the stimulus things in this package, they'll create more jobs per dollar in the energy efficiency projects than anything else, by far, if we've got a financial system that works. So those are the things that I obsess on. I think that I'm afraid poor people within the United States and within rich countries are going to get left behind. I'm afraid, and within the developing world, I'm afraid that a lot of the health gains of the last few years are going to be stymied because building health systems is not as sexy, as you will, as providing medicine. And I'm afraid we're not going to do what we need to do on climate change. Those are the things I worry about.
Mr. President, we unfortunately come to the end of this conversation. We are in this crisis and we are in a very specific situation. What would be your advice, first to the politicians in the room, and second, one single important advice based on your long political experience, first to the politicians in the room, and second to the business leaders in the room, and number three, to the representatives of civil society who are here. Do you have one advice for each of those?
The politicians, I would say, this is not a time for denial or delay. Do something that makes sense. Give people confidence by showing confidence, by acting in a way that is consistent with your long-term objectives. To the business people, I would say this is a crisis of finance and asset devaluation. If you are producing a product or a service that you know will be in demand in the 21st century, then it'll come out all right if you can figure out how to get through the storm. You know, it's always and to the NGOs, I would say, a lot of us lost a lot of money too because our wealthy donors could no longer support us. So we're going to have to use the internet and use our ability at mass communications to get more citizens to be at modest levels to be our financial base. We're going to have to redefine 21st century citizenship so that even people of modest means think they ought to give a little money or a little time to the non-governmental movement. And the restructuring we have to do now, many of us, will be good for us. We should come out on the other side of this, I think. And to all of you, I said, look, life should never have any guarantees. This is bracing, but if we do this right, when we come out of it, we'll have a sounder, more decent economy, a better awareness about what not to do as well as what to do. And we have to get through it together. But I think it's a mistake to bet against people who are free to make good choices. I still think you should bet on the future. Don't be pessimistic. That's just an excuse not to do anything. Just think, and fear is paralytic. Avoid fear. Just think, and just keep going. Put one foot in front of another. I think I've been in a lot of tights in my life, and I found that just keeping going is pretty good strategy. I just think that this is not a time to cave in. Don't give up. Don't bet against yourself. Don't bet against your country. Don't bet against humanity's future. It's still a good time to be alive.
Thank you, Mr. President.